Okay. So the format of this evening, we're just going to keep everything quite informal. We've got a little bit of a talk from David Thomas to start with, who's just going to go over the main points. And then we'll hand over to Michael to pick up on the legalities of the new budget review. Also, Peter will be sort of going over what help and support we've got out there from the Farming Community Network. So tonight's actually been funded by the DEFRA welfare project that the Farmer Network is running at the moment. So a great thanks goes to DEFRA for a change to allow us to do these sorts of events and meetings. So without further ado, I'll hand over to David.
Okay, thank you very much. Good evening to everybody. So I'm just going to give some headline rates, which I'm sure you're all aware of. Obviously, there's a £1 million allowance or limit being restricted by the government on most individuals and into trusts. So what we're really looking at here is, if you're looking to gift money and the like, really, or gift land at the time being. So yeah, it's looking at agricultural property relief, business property relief, and the changes around that, which don't come into effect just yet. So that's an important bit to remember. This is from 6th of April 2026. So this has not been brought into law, and there could be various changes still to come. So that's an important part to think about and consider. There's time on our hands at this moment in time. So yeah, there'll be a technical consultation early in the new year with the government, and that will iron out some more issues that were currently coming to light with regards to the £1 million limit. So they're the changes that are coming in. We've got to then plan ahead and think about, what's going to happen in the future. So there's various plans of action, and I think the first thing we need to try to establish is what is the potential exposure for most people. So, i.e., what is the estate worth? So people really need to sit down, think about the considerations around land, buildings, as well as business assets, and does that exceed this £1 million allowance? And how can we review that and look at that? So the £1 million allowance won't be a lot for a lot of people, but if we can limit that exposure by spousal transfers, we need to consider that as well. An important bit about the spousal transfer is, it goes 50-50, but ideally it needs to be a percentage each rather than you holding it jointly. And I'm sure Michael will probably agree with me with that tune that really everything needs to be held as tenants in common for the future. I don't know if Michael's got any points on that. But he will no doubt come back later on that aspect. And that leads us on to looking at wills and partnerships agreements, and how that's going to interact with any of these transfers and various gifts. We just need to be careful with the gifts, because of course once you've given something away, you lose control, and that gift really has to be absolute, i.e. you can't retain any control or benefit from that gift, because in essence it's not a gift then. And that's what we really need to focus on in that respect. There's lots of options. Some people like trusts. I'm not a fan of trusts. They're expensive, they're complicated, and it doesn't suit everybody really. So that's just another consideration is the trusts. On the gift side, if you're looking to gift something down the generation, there is options there with regard to avoiding capital gains tax. We can hold over any gains, and those gains. The downside of holding over a gain is obviously the next generation inherits the original cost value to the individual. So if you're not looking to ever sell any land or buildings or anything, it shouldn't be an issue. And that's the main bit. People need to focus on as well. What are the plans in the future? Because there's a lot of planning in and around what do you gift, when do you gift it. But for the older generation, certainly gifting needs to be done sooner rather than later if you're considering that, because there's a 7-year sort of ticking allowance on that. and that will affect a lot of the older generation, the 7-year period. Now, with regard to this 7-year period, there is some question marks at the moment, I've heard, around the £1 million allowance. Now, will that reset once the 7-year time has passed? Some seem to suggest that £1 million is a lifetime allowance. So if you gift something, that's your gift done, the £1 million. But we'll understand more of that in the new year when this consultation happens. So I don't want to dwell too much on some of that, apart from saying really what we need to do is just plan. Planning will help most people. It's difficult to say how many people it will impact. Obviously, the government are saying very few. I think it could be a lot as it stands, but with effective planning, I think we can help majority of people through this. And that's one of the main points is do not panic. We're all here to help and advise. Every farm is individual and it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. So that's what I think we've got to remember in all of this. When I look at wills and partnership agreements, there's obviously power of attorneys to consider, and that's really where I think Michael will come in and advise as well. So I think the accountant and the lawyers have to work together closely with each person really and advise from there. Okay, and I don't know if Michael wants to come in now and discuss anything on that side of it.
Well, I think what you say is right, David. It's more important now than ever that your accountant, probably land agent, and certainly lawyer all need to work together now. But we don't need to be looking at sort of knee-jerk reactions to what's happening, because we're not certain what is going to happen. We think it's unlikely that there are going to be major changes from where the budget's left us, but you'd hope that with the consultation period, the government will listen to what the industry is saying and what professionals are saying, because it's fact that the government saying 500 farms are going to be affected is a gross underestimation in my view. Probably like David, I've had goodness knows how many calls over the last few weeks, and I've had quite a lot of farmers actually coming in to see me. And out of all the people I've spoken to, probably only 2 of them are completely unaffected. If you're a couple farming, husband and wife, and everything's in husband's name or wife's name, it's going to be a sensible thing to do, to look at how you transfer the farm, to split the value between spouses. As David says, making sure the farm is held as tenants in common so that the farm doesn't all pass to the survivor, which is historically what's happened. Unfortunately, I am seeing a number of farming clients where maybe wife has died and husband is now the sole owner of the farm, and indeed vice versa, where £1 million of allowance is gone. And unfortunately, the new arrangements don't allow for a transferable agricultural or business relief, as happens, for example, with your ordinary 325, where you leave your estate to the survivor gets your nil rate band, your 325. So it's just vital that we make sure that wherever possible we use both £1 million of allowance. Your wills are going to be a massive part of this, to make sure that you're not leaving all of your estate to your surviving spouse. Certainly that your share in the farm isn't going to your surviving spouse, because that's going to mean that 1 million of the potential 2 million of agricultural and BPR relief will have gone. It's looking at your partnership agreement. There are a few things. Partnership agreements have been looked at quite a lot recently, as David will know, because leaving aside what's going on here, the banks have been very keen to make sure partnerships don't come to an end on death, and the partnership agreements record that. So we've been looking at them quite a lot in recent times, but this is another opportunity to look at them, looking at what your interest in the capital of the partnership is, finding out whether your farmland is on the balance sheet of the is in the partnership and then on your accounts. Whether there's any merit of transferring interest in the partnership, maybe to equalise them between husbands and wives, but also whether you have other partners, family members involved in the business. So a lot of what I think is going to be looked at over the course of the next probably year and a bit until this comes in April 26 is focusing on how partnerships have a succession. That really, I think, leaving aside the professionals in this, is a matter of you all sitting down and talking to your families and finding out what you want, but also what they want. You know, a lot of it's going to be a case, do your children, your grandchildren want to farm? Because this may be something which preempts changes within the farm partnership or your business arrangements. And there's no point you making decisions to go down one avenue if those who are possibly going to succeed don't agree with that or don't find that an attractive proposition. In the context of this, clearly you need, as I say, your accountant involved. You need to know what is on your accounts, what your interest in the capital of the partnership is, or in your sole trader business. It's probably going to be the case that you're going to need some valuations, because without the valuations, you're not going to know what we're dealing with. If your farm is worth £3 million, then we need to know it's worth £3 million. If it's worth 1.8 million, we need to know it's worth 1.8 million so that we can work out how best to deal with possibly a split in the business. It's very easy at the moment to think, right, well, we'll give assets away, but as David has quite rightly said, that has an impact. It may be that it ends up with some capital gains tax being paid on the gift or transfer. It may be that the gain is held over by those who are receiving the gift. But those are not easy decisions to be made, and they need to be made calmly, not as knee-jerk reactions, taking the advice from your accountant, taking the advice from your lawyer, but your accountant in particular, I think, is key on this, because those who are succeeding need to know what their exposure is. And it comes back again to the discussions. If it's a case that, for example, you have an 80-year-old farmer with a 60-year-old son and nobody else wanting to succeed, and father is going to transfer land to son and the gain is being held over, potentially, if that 60-year-old is only going to work until he's 65 or 70, it's a gain that's being held up for a few years, but possibly the tax that's payable when son retires may be an awful lot more than father might pay now if there's a retirement. But so these are things which need to be considered carefully. Having those valuations, having the advice from your accountant, and then having the advice and input of your lawyers. None of this is simple, but making the wrong decisions now are going to impact, because a lot of what you could do and what might be necessary and sensible, if it's done right, would be great. But if it's done wrongly or you rush at it, it will have long-term impacts. So my advice at the moment is just, it's not so much wait and see, but it's take baby steps. Get the information together and then make decisions. Speaking to your family and then talking to the professionals. And there, David, do you think you need to pick up on, or you disagree with?
No, I'm completely in agreement. I think just, baby steps. Let's not rush into anything. Look at that exposure. Understand what is the farm worth. Do you jump down straight to a valuer? I'm not so sure. You might want to get a valuation straight away. You might not. Sometimes you can work out a good estimation of what's there. and then you can take the bigger steps. Then, you know, as I say, we don't want to rush into this. There's lots of consultation next year. Things could change slightly or a lot. We're waiting and seeing, really. And I think that's the important bit that I think we're both in agreement with, Michael, is we don't rush into this.
Yeah, I think that's important. I'll just pick up one thing about the valuations, if I may, David. It's assumed that if you have a farm, the farm is going to benefit from this relief, and probably predominantly that is almost certainly going to be the case. But you have to remember that if there's non-agricultural value on the land, so for example, you have farm buildings which are semi-redundant on a roadside, you have a nice farmyard with a use shape of farm buildings, for example, or land within a village envelope which may get planning permission, particularly now with the push for development, then the valuers, quite properly, because that's how they have to value, will look at what is the agricultural value, but they'll also look at what is a non-agricultural value over and above that. And that will not benefit from the £1 million, just as it doesn't benefit now from agricultural property relief. So that also needs to be borne in mind, because that might be an added dimension which needs to be looked at the same time. You're looking at the how you deal with the farm and the agricultural reliefs which are going to be there, being at the £1 million, and then the 50% relief over and above that.
Yeah, I mean, business property relief might cover some of those hope values that you might talk about regarding that development. So, you know, we'd have to look at it in the round. Yes, every farm will be different.
Absolutely. Yes. I think that's the significant thing, David, that every farmer's circumstances are different, and it's not something that you can get it right over a pint with by talking to your neighbours, and because your neighbours' circumstances will be different to yours.
Yeah.
Yours will be different to someone else's. So it's important for somebody to look at your circumstances, not be sort of trying to second guess what might be best for you, looking at what is good for somebody else down the road. And unfortunately, we're all inclined to do that a little bit.
Yeah, and you know, this is where the planning comes in as well. You know, you look at something that could get development value, you won't be looking to gift that now. You would be looking to that, you know, pass it down on death to get the increased value. So that's where
absolutely
planning comes in.
Yes. Well, the difficulty is we never know, do we? You know, you don't know what's around the corner. You can just plan for today, or plan when we know what the circumstances are, looking at the law and the tax regime which is in existence at that date. You know, we've been using the same regime now for a long time, since the early 1990s, when the tax reliefs for BPR and APR were increased from 50%, which was the regime before, which I'm probably both of us are old enough to remember that. So I suppose that's one thing to remember, is that what we've got now, or what we're going to get probably from 2026, isn't brilliant. Far from it. But historically, owner-occupied land benefited from 50% agricultural property relief. If you were a landlord and owned land which was agricultural, you got 30%. So now you're getting £1 million and 50%. So it's not brilliant, but it's better than it used to be in the early 1990s. But good planning should, as you say, David, have an impact on reducing the exposure of the farms to inheritance tax. Some we might be able to get out of the inheritance tax regime for the agriculture, for the farm. Others, it's just a matter of reducing the exposure.
Yeah, it's quantifying that, you know, that tax exposure, really. And then people can make their own judgments from there.
Absolutely, and the tax shouldn't wag the farm dog. You know, what's right shouldn't necessarily be wagged by simply looking at the inheritance tax.
Yeah, because like you said, we'll be looking around way, and a little bit of inheritance tax could save a fortune in capital gains tax, of course.
Potentially, yes. Yeah.
So I saw a question popped up, but I can't see that now, so I don't know whether Carol can bring that to us.
Yeah. Stephen, do you want to ask it? You unmute, Stephen, and then you can.
Yeah, Carol, I found the old mute button.
Thank you.
No worries. Thank you very much. Thank you for interesting things. Might be at this time more questions and answers. And every case is different, as is different farms as well. But my question was, valuations are very important, but if land valuations take a dive at some point, does the valuation kick in at time of transfer or time of death? And leading on to that, some people are suggesting valuations could drop by anywhere between 20 and 30%, bearing in mind the valuations in the early 90s were probably about a quarter of what they are now.
Absolutely.
Yeah, well, I spoke to a valuer, and he suggested they might only drop 5% because it's still very much, the rate is still really low for a lot of investment. So his view was, I was thinking it was going to be potentially 20%, but he was like, no, I think it'll only be 5%. So that will be an interesting fact to see how and when that happens. If there is a drop, but yes, the values will be the value at time of transfer or time of death. Do I answer your question?
Which?
Well, either or.
It depends whether if you're transferring as a gift, it'll be at that point. And then if you survive the 7 years, it'll be fine. If obviously you die within that 7 years, it's got to be factored back into the estate.
Right. Okay.
On the issue of the valuations, which David was mentioning, and the drop in the value, I've had the same from valuers. They've said, well, we thought as the BPS was coming out of the system, land values would drop. It hasn't happened. The appetite in the market, farmers want more land. Now, whether that stays the same is a different question. But then in the market, we have a huge number of charitable organisations buying land. And that is sometimes for silly money, and that's keeping the price fairly high. You look around. The Woodland Trust are buying land, National Trust are buying land. There's various wildlife and rewilding charities buying farms. The Rothbury estate sold to a charity for good money. All those things will keep the values high, and unfortunately, these charities are not subject to the same taxes that you are.
So the answer is become a charity.
That feels like it, possibly.
If we could.
Yes.
Yeah. That's a bit of an unlevel playing field. That's very naughty, because I think I know where the charities you're talking about. One particular well-known charity is probably worth $1/3 billion.
Yeah.
It's got a annual income of about 50 million and about another 50 or 60 million in the bank, and that's completely unfair.
But you've got a political class who's interested in rewilding. They're not, this just plays to that audience, doesn't it? Unfortunately, and it isn't fair.
Oh yeah. The only thing that's going to save us is when, dare I say it, and I've said this before, when folk get hungry, all bets are off. And what will happen is that the farms can only get so big, because if they get much bigger in acreage, they're going to get a bigger tax bill for anything over the X amount yet to be decided, the 2 or whatever million. So that will actually bring either more land onto the market, but it won't encourage farmers to get too big, because they know they're going to get taxed on it. It's not going to be beneficial to do that. So it's going to have a counterproductive be very counterproductive in reference to of farmers getting into the market.
Yeah, I completely agree. The food security is going to be massively impacted by this, and it's not discouraging any of those coming out of the city as well, buying land. The government should have targeted, in my opinion, rollover relief. That's where they should have targeted.
Right.
Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you.
Is there any other questions anybody'd like to ask?
Sorry, Stephen again. I've got another question. It's
Yeah.
been suggested that, I think one of you suggested it, that a way around in gifting is actually give it to each of your children to spread the tax burden out. Can you just clarify that?
Oh, I think I suggested that,
I've
Stephen.
heard it said before.
Yeah, I suggested, but David had touched on it before. The difficulty is that you have this situation that if you give land away, the taxman looks at what you bought it for, acquired it for, and then what is it worth now? If you and you pay capital gains tax on the difference. So you bought some land for 100,000, it's worth 500 now, you've got a gain of 400 and you pay tax on that. Unless that gain is held over, in which case your children acquire it on gift at your base cost, your 100,000. And then if they come to sell at some point in the future at £1 million, theirs is a difference between 100,000 and £1 million, so that their gain is 900,000 in very basic terms. David will keep me right on this, Stephen. So it's not a silver bullet. It's one way that you can look at dealing with things, but it has to be looked at is this the right decision for the farm and the family concerned? Because if it's the case that children receive a farm and then sell it shortly afterwards, then they're going to be landed with the same large capital gains tax bill, or potentially a larger capital gains tax bill. You know, we're being fairly lucky, if you look at it like this, that in that capital gains tax rates have been the lowest they've been. So there's only one way for them as far as I can see. But David might have a different view on that, I don't know.
Well, yeah, the capital taxes could go up. We're surprised it didn't go up in this budget, to be honest with you. It's a surprise. Look, if you're never looking to sell any land, it's probably not an issue. My main concern is what I've heard the past week is this £1 million limit. You know, is that a lifetime limit, i.e., in lifetime or death? There has been some rumours. If you gift something now, you're using your allowance. You might still live your 7 years, but it's used that allowance up already. And that's a concern for the planning side for me. Because yes, you think, well, we can pass some down to the children and have, a multi-generational farm owning lots of different land between you all and be free of the inheritance tax. But there's suggestions that might not be able to happen. So that's why we're waiting for this consultation early next year to see the nitty-gritty of it all, really.
Sorry, go on. Just coming back, was it more beneficial to actually give it to all the children? If you had 3 children, for example, give them 30% each. Because most farmers have either got no children, or they've got a lot of children who actually don't want anything to do with it, but they'd run off with all the money. Is it more beneficial, to actually dish it out to all the children evenly from a tax perspective? But that might not be good for the family or the farm.
It's a difficult one, that, because it can depend, really. It depends what they want to do with that said money. Obviously, you've lost control, you've given it away. There's lots of considerations thereafter. And, if they're not going to farm, their tax rate could be even higher. They won't even have any allowance, of course.
And there's some farms who actually haven't got any to succeed anyway.
Yeah, well, that is another main problem. Yeah, what can one do thereafter? If there's no one to succeed, yeah, there's going to be a big tax burden from this government, really, imposing it on everybody.
And that's probably one of the parts I was talking about earlier on, of having that conversation. Who is going to carry on the farm? Because unfortunately, unpalatable though it might be that the decision is it's better personally not to carry on the farm. Now, that has significant tax consequences if the farm's sold and you have a pile of cash in an account. But if somebody's flogging themselves into their 80s working, but without anybody succeeding, only to benefit from a tax relief. That's maybe not the sensible thing to do. This might, if you have a conversation, allow children to focus on, do they want to farm or do they not want to farm? And at least everybody knows where they stand. Having that conversation, which sometimes, unfortunately, is avoided.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'll give
Thank
somebody
you.
else a shout. But if everyone dries up, I'll come in again.
Thanks, Stephen. From one Stephen to another. Stephen Harrison, do you want to ask your question or do you want me to read it out? Where are you? There you are.
2 seconds.
Unmute. You're on mute, Stephen.
It's just regarding the £325,000 standard relief, which obviously can be upgraded to £500,000 for the house. If a farmer hasn't got that many assets outside of the farm, is that money actually allowable above the £1 million agricultural property relief, or is it only up to the value of their other assets?
No, you get your million plus up to that £500,000. So when you hear people talking about a couple with 3 million, it's $1 million each plus up to that £500,000. The 325 basic band plus the 175 resident nil rate band. So potentially
But that's regardless of what those assets are in, because I'd understood that one pot's classed as the farm and one pot's classed as other assets. But that's not the case, is it not?
No, well, that was I understand it. It's all included, so you can have one up to £1.5 million.
Right, and if there's because my father's died already, and the farm's still on with my mother.
Yeah,
she's 81, so it's too late to gift it. And I'm just looking at the relief from my dad. The £500,000 will still be there, won't it?
Yeah, if he's not used that that remains. Yeah.
So then there's £500,000 for my mum.
Yeah.
So we'd then be looking at 20% above 2 million of that then.
Pretty much, yeah, because $1 million for your mum, plus the £500,000 for your father, plus your £500,000 for your mother.
It just seems to be the grey area work, because it's only like a £200,000 house that she lives in, you say, which is the main outside of the farm. Obviously, the farm itself, it's probably 2.5 million altogether, you say. Yeah,
well, it just drops into a normal estate. Once you go over the $1 million, it just drops into normal inheritance tax rules, and so that would just drop into that. So yeah, anything over those limits will then come. What you might find is anything over the 2 million, it could be at the 40%, not the 20%, because it depends which assets have gone over.
Okay.
Because it's in a certain order of ruling. So yeah, you'll take the farm assets first for the $1 million, and then if the house was above that 500, that could be potentially at 40% rather than 20.
The house has to be. You have to have a house to be able to qualify for 500,000, don't you?
Yes, yeah, you have to.
Yeah, so it should then be the farm that's above that, really.
Yeah, I mean, what you'll find is they won't get £500,000 each if the house is only worth 200. They won't have 175 each because it'll be capped at the 200. If the house is only worth 200, the 175 is for the house. So it's up to 350. So if the house is only worth 200, you'd only get 200 of that allowance.
Oh, I see. Right.
Okay, so it'll be 2 lots of 325 plus the 200.
Right. Okay, that's fair enough. It's just to give us something to work off, so we know.
You've got to have those conversations, and you've got to look at that exposure and see, what is over those limits, because there's even pensions being dragged into it. So if there's any private pensions, you've got to consider that as well.
Yeah, it's everything really.
Yeah, so it could be a case of, I know you're saying she's 81. She might still live 7 years. So we need to get that. Is there a reasoning? Let's get some of this moved over now. Even give you that chance.
I suppose that's the other question, though. What are the implications if it is passed over and she dies in 3 years?
Well, it'd be dragged back into her estate.
Dragged back into there, isn't it? But is it dragged back to the full rate? Or is it
Well,
tracked by, on a
in
sliding
fact,
scale?
yeah, it's on a sliding scale, some of it, but it gives you that chance, you know, to have that opportunity to maybe, you know, lessen that exposure. So it's having that conversation and see what is the risk, what are the chances, but you give yourself a fighting chance potentially.
Yes. Yeah, Dave's quite right. If you do nothing, you know what the situation is going to be. You know, your mum may be around in 7 years' time, or even a lesser period if there's the taper relief where it's going down by 20%, the tax is going down by 20% a year after the third anniversary. It's just not easy, and you know, your circumstances demonstrate that everybody's circumstances are different, because what's being publicised is, well, you get a couple, you get your £3 million. Well, if you've got a spouse who's died beforehand, it's not quite as easy as that. We've got this residence nil rate band, which historically, I was going to say historically wasn't used in connection with farms because it wasn't needed, because you benefited from agricultural property relief on the farmhouse generally if it was appropriate to the size of your farm. And it is just going to be a case of looking at your circumstances and working out what will best work. But unfortunately, of course, when somebody's of a certain age, the sooner you act, the better.
Yeah. It's obviously historically we've been taking advice, but it's been classed that she's best to still own the farm and be partner of the farm to
Absolutely. And nobody would have given you any different advice to that, Stephen, because you know, your mum would get 100% agricultural relief, business property relief. Her assets would be uplifted on death for capital gains tax. So why would you give land away and risk a capital gains tax bill, or lumber your successors with a larger capital gains tax bill if they sell? But unfortunately, the playing field is changing.
Yeah, I know. There only seems to be half the information out yet, though, doesn't there? So it's
the government don't know what they're doing, frankly.
Don't think anyone's going to disagree with you there.
No.
Right. Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Stephen. That's grand. Richard Stockdale asks about existing trusts. Richard, do you want to?
I know David's not a fan of trusts, but he knows that historically we've got some land in trust within 4 names of some of the partners. Two of those names are within their late 80s and 2 are in their early 60s. And just really, when it's in trust, what does it actually mean it's in trust?
Well, it's difficult. We have to read exactly what the trust deed says for a start. You know, what does it imply? What are the indications of that said trust? But yes, the trust, this could then impact inheritance tax rules with regard to, you know, 10-year anniversary charges, for example. You know, is it going to be a tax charge all of a sudden when we hit that 10-year cycle? And, you know, how much is in the trust? Is it part of the £1 million allowance anyway? So, yeah, it's just reading into that and looking exactly what the wording is.
And why would they put in trust in the first place? Was that to avoid tax or try and avoid tax in the first place? And then probably going to catch up with this eventually?
Some of it could be. As I say, you have to read what the sort of trust deed says. To me, you know, why has it gone in the first place? It wouldn't be my question as well. I don't know what that advice would have been at that time.
I suppose on this, David, jumping in, there are a multitude of reasons assets can go into trust. One might be on the first capital gains tax benefits. It might be the case that it's a matter of protecting family members. So it might be a second marriage. You know, there are a multitude of reasons why trusts are set up to give protection for families. And historically, agricultural land in trusts has been the same as agricultural land held by an individual. You get your 100% relief. But I think David's probably right that the trust getting £1 million of inheritance tax allowance, if the land value in the trust has a value of more than £1 million, on the 10-year anniversary of the trust or each successive 10-year anniversaries, then there will be a relatively modest, but still nonetheless there will be a tax charge. And likewise, if you take the assets out of the trust, there's likely to be a tax charge as an exit charge. But it depends upon the value of the assets in the trust.
Thanks.
Thanks, Richard. A message here from a lady, I'm sorry, I can't see your name, about some companies that can provide advice. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, it was just, are there any support organisations that people who have got concerns about what's been raised can approach for some sort of initial advice without necessarily incurring, you know, some substantial potentially legal costs and administration costs to facilitate the decision-making process to get them to a stage where actually they're ready to make the decisions for professionals to act upon?
Well, I think the starting point is the organisations like the NFU, like Farmer Network. I don't know where you're based at, but further north there's a charity called UTAS in Teesdale. The Country Landowners and Country Land and Business Owners Association, they will be able to provide some assistance. But the difficulty is that most of them are not able to advise you in the way that you'd need to. They can give you some initial guidance, I think, and pointers in the right direction. But because what you do is so personal to you, it's very difficult for them to have people easily on hand. Now, it may be the NFU will provide a bit more specialist guidance. I don't know. That's probably something that NFU members need to talk to them about and see what is available.
Yeah, as a starting point as well, we've also got Peter Beresford on the call from Farming
Yes.
Community Network, who also can sort of point you in the right directions. I think we're struggling a little bit with technology, aren't we, Peter? We can't hear. He can hear you. He can hear us, but we can't hear him. So yeah, as a starting point, you know, we can refer you to FCN, and they can like be almost like a mediator, if you like, if you want to be discussing, you know, the sticky subject of the children wanting to take on the farm, that sort of thing, as we can at the Farmer Network as well. So I think sort of as we kind of all have been hearing tonight, that it's good to talk and to make some initial plans, isn't it? So yeah, pick up the phone, as Michael said, as a starting point. It's worth sort of saying I can pass on details of everybody's contacts this evening as well, if you'd like to chat whatever to Peter or another colleague of his or myself or anything. Stephen, have you got another question, statement?
Just demuted. So the answer's yes. What was the question? Forgotten now. You spooked me then. Just give us a minute. He'll come back to me.
Have we any other questions?
Right, my question. Have any trade organisations come up with a figure? The government say it's not going to be it's going to be only a few farmers. It kind of are, or landowners. That's another question. If there's not going to be very many going to be affected, why did they come up with it in the first place? We all agree that there's going to be a lot more businesses affected. Has anyone actually come up with any figures of how many businesses will be affected by this in the medium to long term?
I think anybody has. I think that's where the argument lies fully. Certainly, when I look at a lot of my clients, there is a significant amount of them that are going to be affected. Whether with this planning we can manoeuvre things round is another thing. 3 million between a couple, if it was a couple, isn't a lot. So when you start bringing the children in, you can up that even further. But there's obviously dangers with passing generationally on and all sorts with that really. So it's difficult to say how many will be affected, but with planning, you can certainly lessen any exposure, I would say.
Thank you. Patrick, you have a question about inheritance tax run as a limited company. Do you want to ask a question?
Yeah. Is it 20 or is it 40%? Because I'd heard both figures mentioned. I was hoping it was 20, like.
Patrick, the situation is that over the exemption, if you call it that, the £1 million or whatever, then you're given a 50% relief, and what's over that is taxed at 40%. So essentially, it's a 20. Both are right. It's a 20% tax if you take into account the 50% relief. Does that make sense, Patrick?
No.
So, right.
Only a simple that. Say again.
No. So if you have £1 million, and you knock 50% off, you're down to £500,000. And if you tax that by 40%, you have £200,000 of tax.
Right.
Right. So that's 40% of £500,000. But if you did 20% of £1 million, it would be £200,000. So, but the relief takes it down to 20% if you look at it that way around. Is that your view, David?
Yeah. It's just how you interpret it. You can look at it different ways, but it still comes back to the same sort of figure at the end.
Yeah. Okay.
You still look a little confused.
We're all confused.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that discount of 50% relates to obviously agricultural property. If you're talking anything else, it'll still be 40%. And no,
Say all like the farm buildings and land takes up your whole $1 million, for example. Then what the value of the company is after that, that's on top of that $1 million. Are you looking at being taxed at 40% or 20% on that? What's in the company? I'm still not quite following you, like, but it's probably just me.
Well, it's obviously different with a company because that'll be, once you've used your $1 million, yes, you've got to consider your $500,000, the 325 allowance as well. But yes, you could be at 40% if it's not classed as agricultural or business property relief.
Well, like I said, the tractors and machinery and all my stocks in a limited company.
Yeah. So yeah,
No.
you're still within the farming regime, so it should still get that 50% discount factor.
Right. Well, that's fine then. Right. I think. Wish I'd asked that question now.
Thank you, Patrick.
Who's next?
It is confusing. Any more questions? I think
Is
we'll
it
sum
just worth
everything up.
asking about wills, in the sense if your circumstances change, and my co-conspirator Stephen Harrison, I think it was, his father had died. Is that quite important to talk about wills in reference to if your circumstances change, you've got to change the will as well?
Absolutely, but you really need to keep your wills under review anyway. Leaving aside what's happening with the inheritance tax regime, you really need to look every 3 to 5 years. You don't need to come and see your lawyer or your accountant about it. Just pick your copy out the drawer. Does it still do what I wanted it to do? Does it still reflect our circumstances? If you've got a child getting divorced, you've bought a bit of land, you've had a death in the family, all these things will affect how you leave your will and how people benefit ultimately when you pop off. But obviously the tax changes are an added reason to look at your will, mainly to ensure that you don't pass your interest in the farm, if it passes under your will, to your surviving spouse. The difficulty is that often you have a situation that your will is irrelevant as far as where land passes to. Husband and wife farming together, the likelihood is your share will probably pass to the survivor automatically by survivorship, irrespective of what your will says. And this is where you'd need to change the joint ownership from what's called a joint tenancy to a tenancy in common. Now, if you're farming with family members other than your spouse, it's probably the case that it won't be a joint tenancy, because most business partnerships or ownership of land for business purposes will usually be held as tenants in common, in which case your share will pass under your will. So again, you wouldn't want to be saying, I give all of my estate to my wife or my husband, when they're going to then inherit your share in the farm, pushing potentially them over their inheritance tax limits and losing your inheritance tax limits. So your will is an integral part of what you do. It's not the only part, but it's quite a serious part.
And adding to that, quite a lot of people don't have wills. So if you haven't got a will now, go and get one.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
But would I just add to that? It's easy for a lawyer to say or an accountant to say, but don't just go to the post office and buy one of the packs and fill it in, because unfortunately, often you fill them in wrongly, thinking they say one thing and actually they say something a little bit different legally to what you thought they said. So it's worthwhile spending a few £100s to get it right.
And that's what you would do it for.
Well, it depends upon your circumstances.
But for example, it could be 300 to 500, for example.
Possibly, yes.
Yes, as a guesstimate. That's all I'm
Yeah.
saying.
Yeah.
And
Money
what
well
about
spent.
trusts as well? Not wishing to hog the limelight again. Somebody mentioned about trusts. There is pros and cons of trusts. Would you like to enlighten us all on that?
Well, the pros are very simple. They give some control. If you, for example, if it's in a will, you die and you've given the farm or assets to a particular person. Once they've got them, they can do with them what they want. So if it were the case that you give all of your estate to your surviving spouse, the money's gone or the assets have gone to your spouse. If that spouse remarries, then you've got another person in the mix who probably won't have the same views on life and your family as you would. So the trust would be helpful there. If it's the case that you have a child who may be in a difficult marriage or is not necessarily very good with money, which is always a problem if you're in business, then a trust might be a useful solution. But on the downside, as David said, there are tax consequences of having trusts. Historically, both shades of politician don't like trusts. They think they're used for tax avoidance. And actually, a lot of trusts aren't. A lot of trusts are used to give protection to families. But there is now a trust registration regime going into trusts. For inheritance tax, there are charges to tax over thresholds. And for income tax, the regime is not very accommodating to trusts. And for capital gains tax, the allowances are virtually nil. They're not very good for individuals, but for trusts, I say they're very, very limited. £1,500 a year of gains, which is nothing really. So they have to be there for the right reason. But if, for example, you have an autistic child who can't handle money, a trust is probably the right thing to do. If you are concerned that your spouse would remarry and the assets of the family would possibly be diverted to a third party, then a trust might be the right thing to do. But it has to be the right thing. It's not just the go-to solution.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michael.
Sure, Carol, I think I've had enough. Nothing personal. Very, very
Thanks,
well
Stephen.
listened. Cheers.
You just ask what everybody else is thinking. That's great. Well, thank you very much. I think we'll sort of summarise and close the meeting because I think it's all kind of blown our heads. I just sort of want to have a bit of a summary. I think we've all sort of said it's good to talk. Let's not panic. And let's start planning our futures really. Looking at wills and partnership agreements. And seek help and advice first and foremost. And has anybody, have you got anything to add, Michael, David?
I've only got one thing to add, and that's something I forgot about. We all think that this will affect mainly owner-occupier farms. It won't, because old style Agricultural Holdings Act tenancies at the moment are subject to 50% inheritance tax against the landlord's value. FBTs, farm business tenancies, have benefited from 100% relief, but FBT occupied land will now be brought into this. So if you're a landlord owning a farm, holding giving a tenant an FBT or a grazing license, those lands are going to be brought into the inheritance tax regime. Sorry, that was just something I'd forgotten about. So apologies, Carol.
Thank you, Michael. That's a good point. Yeah, so thanks everybody for joining us. Just to sort of go into a little bit more detail, we are planning another sort of succession meeting at the Wensleydale Rugby Club on the 25th of February. We've asked Heather Wildman from Saviour Associates to come down and talk to us. Heather is a great mediator and sort of likes to talk about the elephant in the room. So please join us then, 7 p.m. with supper. I'm sure Michael and David, if you'd like to come along and give your opinions as well, that would be great. So yeah, keep an eye out for more advertising on that. Just another massive thank you to David and Michael, and also Peter, wherever you are. Sorry, Peter will give us a bit of a summary about what the FCN can do. Also, David has done a little sheet up with all the main points about inheritance tax and APR, etc. So I can forward that round as well. And obviously I've recorded this evening as well, so we can use that as a go-to as well if anybody forgets what we've done and talked about tonight. Okay, thank you very much.